Is philosophy supposed to go to the edges, like to be kind of this frontier, like to go as far as we can, explorers, be explorers of the universe, of the mind, and so on? Or is it more about, I don't know, hanging out and talking about what the world is?
I think it's a bit of both. I mean, in my book, I think I used the phrase about Rorty, the red, white, and blue Nietzsche. Ultimately, for any thinker or writer, the chief limitation is your own lack of courage.
Hello and welcome everybody to our next podcast. I have with me today Carlin Romano. Hi, Carlin. Carlin is a longtime literary critic at the Philadelphia Inquirer, a critic at large at the Chronicle of Higher Education. He has taught philosophy and communication in different universities, and he was also a Pulitzer Prize finalist. And most importantly, Carlin, you have also been one of the founding members of our Foundation for Philosophical Orientation, which we started 5.5 years ago. So I'm very honored, very happy to have you here with me today. Hi, Carlin. How are you?
I'm good. It's hot here in India, but otherwise, all is fine.
That's great. So you're in India. Yes, it's hot, and
I am in New Delhi.
oh, nice. And so you are also there in terms of what we're going to talk about today, which is the book America the Philosophical, published in 2012. And yeah, we want to, I guess, revisit some of the thoughts of this book. Yeah, I was wondering, so if you're in India, how people react to the book over there so far? Maybe that's something we can start with.
Well, this will shock you. I have a copy, just by coincidence, I have a copy right here. There we go.
Oh, nice.
Paperback edition,
Perfect.
all 672 pages of it. Um, I actually, I get the same reaction really here in India that I got in the United States when it came out, which is that the first reaction is a little bit of shock because the title is meant to be against the grain. And for some people, the title is oxymoronic, meaning not that it's moronic, but that it's a contradiction in itself. People are used to thinking of America as militaristic, as capitalistic, as many things, but not philosophical. So that was part of the idea of the title in my mind to grab people's attention with something that seemed to them counterintuitive. And in the introduction of the book, I give a fair amount of space to the contrary position, America the unphilosophical. What are some of the arguments for that? But then the bulk of the book is, of course, in favor of the title, why I think it's an apt description. And, some of my ways of describing it in the book were controversial. There was a lot of press coverage and a lot of review coverage. Um, but I have to say, I'm quite happy that whatever it is now, 13 years later, the book is still alive. And the best thing that ever happened to me, probably my intellectual career, was that this book got the front page of the New York Times Book Review and two full pages inside. So got into big media, and I think I owe a lot of my foreign invitations and maybe the Fulbright Senior Scholar Award that I'm on right now in India. All of these things in some way have grown out of this book.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's interesting. So one reason I was asking also about the Indian reception is that I mean, India has a very rich philosophical history, right? I mean, especially in ancient, rich philosophical history. We actually just had a seminar about the connections of Dionysus and Shiva and like the time before the Logos, right? Before Plato, before Isocrates, and so on. So we can delve more into those topics. And so I wonder if there is there also a bit of a conception of imperialism in India, or like just like the English came over and now the Americans are telling us how philosophy should look. Is there anything of this, or?
Yeah, yeah, we talked about that. I just gave a lecture um, last Monday at Bennett University, which is a private university owned by the main newspaper of India, the Times of India. And yeah, in our conversation after the talk, several people wanted me to compare things to the Indian philosophical tradition. One of the outrageous outre claims I make in the book is that America, the United States, is the greatest philosophical culture in the history of the world. Uh, Bar none, 19th century Germany, ancient Athens, you name it. And I try to preface when I give these talks by saying that this is not meant to be a jingoistic argument. My country, right or wrong, it's my country, so it's the greatest. It's meant to be a descriptive argument that I think it's really the case for a variety of reasons. Now, in regard, and one point I often make, even though my book largely argues that philosophy is not just professional philosophy, I do argue that this is true even in professional philosophy. I actually looked this up in anticipation of the podcast. Just for example, there are about 205 philosophy departments in India. According to a recent survey, there are 744 philosophy departments in the United States. So just in sheer numbers, in regard to publications, number of philosophy professors, and so on, we have a quantitative argument. But that's not my main argument in the book. The main argument has to do with a combination of one very important thing, our freedom of expression, our diversity, that almost every philosophical tradition in the history of the world is represented in the United States. It's represented in the bookstores, it's represented in departments, represented by individual thinkers trying to have philosophy careers. And so, even when you have as ancient a tradition as the Indian philosophical tradition, it's not remotely as diverse. It's not remotely as independent in that another argument I make, in the book is that, Americans have a kind of rude independence of mind and have traditionally been resistant to arguments from authority and any kind of authoritarian argument. Obviously, today with Trump and so on, that's an issue that's in the air. But in many other cultures, a lot of the philosophy is commentary on master thinkers of one sort or another, which I find less philosophical on the whole. So I know we're going to talk a little bit about orientation. In some ways, you could say other philosophical traditions are much more oriented to other philosophers, to master thinkers, while I would argue that a lot of American thought is oriented to the world as opposed to some thinker here or there.
No, and that's an interesting notion of philosophy, and I think we should delve more into that in a little bit. I mean, in a sense, also our foundation is partaking in America the philosophical in that way, right? I mean that
Absolutely.
right, how we're and that's I mean, and I like a lot of the topics you talk about in terms of the constraints of academic philosophy and what academic philosophy means. And I mean, yeah, my background is in comparative literature, which is also a bit outside of the traditional philosophical field, especially outside of analytic philosophy, which I like that you're pointing out the limitations of that field. But one thing, maybe before we delve into the question of what philosophy is, I was wondering what your thoughts are. And I'm sure you get this question all the time. You finished the book with Obama, with President Obama as the philosopher in chief, right? As the not quite philosopher king, right? But somebody one of the most philosophical presidents ever, and the most since Woodrow Wilson. And then you wrote this in 2012. And then we had Trump presidency number one. Then we had Biden. Now we have Trump presidency number two. And so it's a very different figure in terms of the style, the discourse, the rational discourse, and so on that we see with Trump, right? And so, yeah, I'm sure you have a lot of thoughts, but I was wondering, yeah, so one question is today's age more or less philosophical than 2012, right? And how does Trump fit into all of this?
Yeah, no, it's good question. And I tend to surprise people with that also. Sometimes I give lectures with the title America the Philosophical, But I've often given lectures, and I did this in Trump's first term also with the title America the Philosophical, italicized my book, America the Philosophical in the Age of Trump. You know, some of the anticipatory reaction tends to be like, oh, well, would you please withdraw your book? Your book is so stupid now in light of Trump. Or certainly you have to revise your thesis downward because our culture is getting dopier, than ever. And this guy is a dumbbells, compared to Obama. So how can America the philosophical as a position still survive? And my argument is that actually Trump is very good for philosophy. Um, but here's why. I've never made the argument, and the argument of the book is not that we're a country of whatever 343 million philosophers. We have a lot of stupid people. If we didn't have a lot of stupid people, Trump wouldn't have been elected because anybody with a brain can see through him. The argument is really about our society and the discourse that takes place in our society. And in that respect, I think Trump, particularly because he's like a 12-year-old, and he just speaks whatever comes into his head. Like children, he sometimes provokes philosophical questions without realizing it. So I'll give you an example. I mean, in his first term, when the movement was taking place in the country about getting rid of Confederate statues, um, he said, I forget if it was at a press conference or somewhere else, he's just kind of free associating. He says, so what are we going to do? We're going to knock down the Washington Monument. We're going to blow up the Jefferson Memorial. I mean, where does this stop? I mean, what's a monument anyway? Now, Trump, I think everybody agrees, is not a philosopher. He's not a sophisticated thinker. He has no attention span and so on. But that comment coming in given the enormous soapbox that he has as president, instigated a lot of pieces by intellectuals who said, yeah, this is the question. Is a Confederate statue an honorific? It's honoring the person. Is it a documentation of a particular life, good or bad? Should we knock them down? Should we put them in museums? Should we replace the plaques so that the information is more accurate or balanced? And that was an example, I think, of how, he can shoot off a comment that is often beyond the pale to some people. But that's exactly what philosophy is about, questioning assumptions, thinking freshly about something. So I would say another example with everything that's going on now in Los Angeles with, the protests and his calling up the military and so on. If we just thought about political philosophy, there's no question that the way he operates has provoked all sorts of deep philosophical questions about our political system, about the importance of judicial review, the power of the presidency, what constitutes fascism, right? Many people are saying this is fascism. Well, so fascism is back on the front burner as a concept in philosophy. Jason Stanley's written a lot about it. Other people are contesting about it. So I would never call Trump a philosopher, but in the same way that, when a kid asks her father, why is the sky blue? Why is water wet? Um, he does actually feed philosophical discussion.
I fully agree with that. Definitely. I mean, there's a lot more surprises that happen in the time of Trump, right? And there's a lot more things that, I guess, things that we have taken for granted, we question, right? And that's
Mhm.
maybe also what, maybe an aspect of what philosophy is about, right? But yeah, that's maybe something we can talk about. Just to stick with this topic a second, I mean, there's also the importance of Elon Musk, for example, right? And one thing I always notice is that, I mean, and now they have this, disagreement and so on. But one thing is that he is also somebody, and both are extremely controversial, of course, but he's one of those who takes a bit of a philosophical stance when it comes to what he's trying to do, right? So you don't see this very often where he's trying to say, well, I want to make life multiplanetary, right? And I want to make sure like the human species survives. We have a short period of time. It's at least a kind of talk that you don't really hear very often, not even from Jeff Bezos, not from Trump. And I mean, maybe Kennedy wanted to go to the moon, right? But I mean, one thing that is interesting, right, that these questions become wider again,
Mhm.
right? And I don't know if you have any thoughts about this on Trump, on
Well,
Musk.
I do. I mean, if you were comparing the two of them, I think Musk is certainly more philosophically oriented than Trump. The way in which it interconnects with his business interests is another matter. But take what just happened again in the last day or two. I don't know if you saw this, but Musk has in a way apologized. He had a tweet or an X, whatever he's calling it these days, saying that he went too far in his criticisms. And just in a little bit of international TV I was watching today, I saw that, some of the anchors are, did he apologize? Was that an apology? Will Trump accept it? Now, apology is a very interesting philosophical concept. I mean, we sometimes teach it, in ethics courses and all of that. History is full of, European leaders, say, going to Africa and not quite apologizing for whatever colonialist things they did, but saying some things, and then the local people say, well, that's not quite an apology. Um, so, I would say you have another example with the kind of, rhetorical mayhem that has been taking place from, Trump and Musk of, again, philosophical concepts getting shot in the air. It wouldn't shock me at all if in the next week in the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, you saw a couple articles like, was that an apology? What's an apology? Because the intellectuals and the philosophically oriented are drawn to concepts. And when an event basically launches a concept in the air, some intellectual comes in and zeroes in on the concept. That to me is philosophical.
Yeah, no, I fully agree, and I like that, and it's interesting to observe for sure. And
Mm.
one thing that's also you see, this is a lot of this is happening in new media, right? And I mean, on X, for example, on Truth Social, on social media, and so on. And so it's also that begs the question of, how do discourses change once we have what you call cyber philosophy, right? You have a chapter on it, which I appreciate. One question that also comes up though in these contexts, right? And it's the question of what you talk about in a sense, philosophy as an agora of a place where everybody can voice or free speech and so on. And now with these discourses on social media at the same time, you have, I think political polarization is very much connected with that, right? With these different media. And so that it
Mm.
goes into different fields where they build their own realities in a sense, right? And so we just had a seminar actually on political polarization, and one of the points is that basically the left and the right in America often they live in two different universes, right? That has
Mm.
often been my impression. I mean, living here for a long time now, and because they believe in different media, they believe in different truths and different plausibilities and different values, and so on the very basic level, right? They believe in very, very different fundamentals, right? And so in that sense, I mean, do you see any, I guess, yeah, dangers in that sense, or does it shift, or is that something also because it happened in the last 13 years a lot? Would you say that makes America maybe more constrained in terms of philosophical debates?
No, I again would see it in the other direction. One of the questions you kind of floated to me in advance was, are the things more philosophical or less philosophical since the book was published? Well, if you think of this phenomenon of false news or accusations of false news, fake news, disinformation, I think everybody agrees that there's been a huge increase in disinformation. Which are the examples are what people in a polarized culture, disagree about. Think of, so what's the implication of that for one of the central concepts in the history of philosophy and particularly professional philosophy, knowledge, right? Our concept of knowledge has been very much put in question by disinformation and fake news charges and all of that. Now, as you know, if you've been reading my book, I kind of celebrate Richard Rorty, my former teacher. I was his research assistant when he was writing Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature. He had like a 10 howitzer attack on epistemology as the center of philosophy. It's a waste of time, or at least the way analytic philosophers do it. I'd have to say, even though I largely agree with that, it's become a little more important than it was because of our need to distinguish truth from falsehood, because of our need to basically knock down false knowledge and so on. So I agreed with him about a lot of the way analytic philosophers approach the concept, necessary and sufficient conditions, things like that, Gettier problem. But I think a sociological approach to knowledge, what do we consider verified knowledge? What are the sources we go to? What constitutes a consensus, that Beijing is the capital of China and it's not Paris and it's not London? That is important work. And I think it has become more important in an age of disinformation. And so I kind of let epistemology grab a little bit more of the territory than I might have when I published the book.
Another innovation that happened was ChatGPT, for example, like in the last 2 years or how long it's been around. And in one aspect, in terms of, let's say, artificial intelligence, and I'm sure it probably has a big impact on the industry of journalism. I wonder, right? I'm using it in my work. It's quite very helpful. But one of the things philosophically that I always think about is this notion of how, and with AI, what AI does, right? It's the large language models and they repeat what other people are saying, right? So they're big apparatuses of repeating in a sense. And so there's something of, I mean, what Nietzsche would call the herd, right? So you do what everybody else is doing. And so you just repeat, you imitate, right? Or Heidegger called it the day, right? You do what everybody else does. And so in a sense, I mean, also even going back to Plato, right? And so this notion of when writing was invented, there was this concern, right, of how thought becomes a part of the medium, and the medium is a mass medium, right? And then there's something maybe gets lost in that sense, right? And so, I don't know, do you have any thoughts on this?
Well, I do think that the old line that people had in regard to, early computer age issues, garbage in, garbage out, applies to ChatGPT and artificial intelligence too. I know I'm not the only person who's put my name into, AI or ChatGPT and found like 7 or 8 mistakes. I've taught at places I never taught. I've published things I never published. So it is definitely a work in progress, very reminiscent of Wikipedia, when Wikipedia began. I assume they'll make progress, So, I end up half on the side of those who think it's one of those drinking the Kool-Aid situations where, as with a lot of new technology, much of the mythology, I would say, of how it's going to change everything is coming from the companies trying to sell it, So in the whole history of technology, whether it's radio or TV or the personal computer or Steve Jobs, it's very hard to tissue apart what the real impact is going to be from the desire of companies to make sure everybody buys one and buys the latest edition and so on. So that's why you're seeing with ChatGPT also, right? Oh, the first one is no good anymore. You have to pay a little bit more and then pay a little bit more for the next level and so on. And it's being expanded, obviously, into things like, you can have a ChatGPT girlfriend. I was just seeing something on cable that some companies selling that your new partner, a ChatGPT woman who looks like a Playboy model. Um, I don't know where all of that's going. If were writing the book now, that cyber philosophy chapter would have to basically absorb also the writing that's taking place about artificial intelligence. So, I call that chapter Gutenberg's Revenge because I was struck by how many books were being published about the consequences of the digital revolution on different areas of life, religion, sex, romance, law, and so on. And, I think we're going through a similar phenomenon, that AI will have impact on all of these different areas. But, will it fundamentally or radically change certain areas? Like, is everyone going to abandon their living boyfriend and girlfriend for a chat GPT one? Are we not going to have anybody writing anymore because it can all be spewed out? I tend to be skeptical toward that. And, if you looked at that chapter, you could see that I talked about cyber politics, cyber religion, cyber literature, but the last part of it was cyber cynics, the thinkers who say like, oh, nothing new under the sun, little things will change. Fundamentally, almost everything will stay the same in human relations. Um, so I'm kind of in the same position as I watched, the AI publicity thing explode. Because I do really feel that, a lot of it is pushed by these gigantic platform companies not wanting to be left behind, trying to convince every business that they should convert to it. Um, we shall see.
No, for sure. It is an interesting development. And I think, I mean, it's also very helpful. It gives you a lot of super interesting information. And I think, I mean, how I always view it is in a sense, we co-evolve with it, right? And so it's not either or, but
But in academia, it's very, controversial, and it's leading to some real challenges legally also. As having been, critic at large of the Chronicle of Higher Education, I follow academic stuff very closely still. And there's recently a case where a student was, suing a professor in a university because it turned out the syllabus had been created by AI. And her attitude was that that's not what I paid for. Also, if I'm remembering right, in that class, the professor was not allowing students to use AI, but turned out he was using it himself. Um, so this is all over the place at the moment in my school at University of Pennsylvania and elsewhere. People have not even decided there be a uniform policy on the part of a university, on the part of a department. Should it be left to the individual decision of professors? Is it a tool that you use? Obviously, it can save time for anyone in writing, but is it also going to deaden creativity? I mean, one thing I notice, when I'm looking at stuff that I know has been produced by ChatGPT, is that it tends to be very light, in addition to the inaccuracies, tends to be very light on detail, on concreteness, a lot of generalities and so on. And in some cases where I've seen that and I pursued it, it turns out somebody, a student has gotten the writing from ChatGPT or has plagiarized it and so on. So, I'm not convinced that we're going to get high quality stuff from basically inputting all of this information in language and so on, and then having it regurgitated.
for sure, yeah, these are great points. And maybe we can delve now into the question of what philosophy is, right? And so,
Mhm.
and of course, I mean the claim of today's America being the most philosophical. I mean, you connected a lot with diversity, for example,
Mhm.
right? Diversity of viewpoints. There's certain discourses with Richard Rorty, right? It's about there are certain stories, there's vocabularies, there's a rewriting, using new vocabularies in a new way. And there's also the notion, as I said earlier, about that we question things that we take for granted, right? And so
Mhm.
I wonder, yeah, what do you think in terms of like what the task of philosophy is, right? And so there's something which, of course, and that goes back to the question or the point that you make about Isocrates and Plato, right? And so in Plato, of course, very, very rich figure where you have all these aspects already, but then also controversial in that sense. But yeah, what maybe we can start there. What is philosophy? What is
Yeah.
the task of philosophy?
So I'm going to start by actually, sharing a quote that I use at the end of my introduction, strangely enough, by the former Economist executive editor Anthony Gottlieb. He actually was the reviewer of my book in the New York Times by coincidence. Uh, but I write at the very end of my introduction, and then I'll kind of gloss it for myself. Say, as scholar and former Economist executive editor Anthony Gottlieb concluded, when he tried to wrap his arms around the history of philosophy from the ancient Greeks to the Renaissance. Quote, this is Gottlieb, the history of philosophy is more the history of a sharply inquisitive cast of mind than the history of a sharply defined discipline. The traditional image of it as a sort of meditative science of pure thought, strangely cut off from other subjects, is largely a trick of the historical light, close quote. I'm not sure if I agree with the historical light image, although it's a lovely one. But again, I argue in the book that philosophy goes way beyond the philosophy profession. I end up talking about other academics, literary critics, psychologists, political theorists, and so on. And I also make an argument about the need maybe to stop distinguishing between supposedly highbrow, middlebrow, and lowbrow forms of philosophizing in the way that in the 20th century, a lot of leading critics like Susan Sontag argued against doing this with art. And that's one of the reasons I think successfully that argument went through. And now there's much more egalitarianism in the art world, as opposed to the idea that you only take seriously as art the highest elite types of art. Popular art now has a tremendous sway in the world and so on. And so, my way of doing that in the book was then to talk about what I called casual Wisemen, journalists, broadcasters who are also doing a form of, philosophy. So, I would agree with Gottlieb that it is an approach to knowledge, to concepts that does not defer to the status quo, whatever has been accepted. I once wrote in a piece, I forget if it ended up in this book, saying philosophy never takes yes for an answer. It's always pushing question every subsidiary thesis, assumption, or so on is itself open to question. And so that type of critical mind, and I would say in a funny way, I ended up more or less where Rorty did in the last collection of his pieces. He uses, or the editors who put together that volume talk about his work as anti-authoritarianism. And I do think one of the fundamentals, sine qua non of philosophy is not accepting authoritative answers from sacred texts, whether those sacred texts are religious texts or even texts from the canon of philosophy. Kant said this, Heidegger said that, and therefore it's true, or we take it for granted. That philosophy really questions everything, but it shouldn't end up only with questions. I'm a believer philosophy should end up with answers too, even if they're tentative, even if they're uncertain or they're linked just to a particular society or context. And this is one reason, since you raised Plato, and as you know, I have that chapter exalting I, Socrates, later in the book. So and some people have differed with me on this and the interpretation of Socrates. But if you do see Socrates um, as the mouthpiece of Plato, arguing that there are right answers that you can get through the dialectical path and so on, I, Socrates, thought these answers are much more tentative and uncertain, and much more dependent on context, society, and so on. So that's why I argue he's kind of the Richard Rorty of ancient Greece, and that Plato inappropriately wrote him out of the history of philosophy, calling him a sophist, calling him a rhetorician. In my chapter, I point out he did not consider himself a rhetorician, did not consider himself a sophist. He considered himself a philosopher. And apropos of your question, the word philosophy was in play at that time. It had no tied down meaning, had no tied down history. And so the idea that you could be a kind of relativist while still being an arguer and a presenter of evidence was a perfectly fine form of philosophy. Philosophy didn't have to be Platonic or Aristotelian or Socratic with a kind of background assumption there's a right answer you're going to get to that everybody will accept. Yeah. So, I still think that way, about philosophy. Yeah, apropos of my Indian experience right now, such a reminder to me that, in the West, we, especially in the English language West, we think of philosophy as all of these texts in English. Now, you know better than it. Nietzsche didn't write in English. Heidegger didn't write in English. These Indian philosophers wrote in Sanskrit and Pali and other languages. There are so many differences of nuance between different languages around the world that, the hubris of so many people in the West that philosophy is this stuff in English, right? Even to the extent of, doing scholarship that rides entirely on foreign thinkers like a Kant, like a Nietzsche, like a Heidegger in English when they're losing nuances that are in the German or in the French and so on. So I think we need much more humility in the West when we think about what philosophy is.
Yeah, no, no, I like that very much. And I mean, very much this notion also of, yeah, philosophy is I mean, I think Aristotle said it begins in wonder, right? That
Yeah.
you don't just take things for granted, but you question, like, why are we talking virtually? Why are we doing this? Why are we speaking English? Why do we have a democracy and so on? It's really just the questioning of the most fundamental things. And that's also, I think, where the philosophy of orientation also helps a little bit in terms of it speaks of plausibilities, right? So that plausibilities is that which we take for granted in our orientation, right? So all the things that are not questioned right now, for example, I keep my balance, and I don't question that I keep my balance, but I take it for granted. And so these are things which happen in every orientation. And so once we question them, that's where philosophy begins, right?
Yeah, no, and I guess what I'm saying is that, orientation, as you know, I consider very useful, concept. I think Werner has contributed a lot by bringing, attention to it. But, what I was just criticizing, I guess, is orienting yourself to the philosophical canon in just one language, where you're kind of ignoring the way other languages in the world slice up the world. And of course, there's a lot of borrowing from, take for example, a word in English, Schadenfreude, right? So we took that word from German because it captures a certain sort of attitude that one has toward the failure of others or wanting the failure of others. Why didn't we have our own word in English? Because languages slice up the world very, differently. And so sometimes when people are trying to do a philosophy of love or a philosophy of justice in a particular language, not understanding that in another language, there may be a greater emphasis, let's say with justice, on desert or on need, or on rights. Those are like three of the traditional components, of a justice theory. But in different languages, the balance is quite different. And this actually explains, I sometimes am explaining to people one of my chapters, the chapter on John Rawls, because for people who haven't read him or who didn't follow his career, they often think, oh, John Rawls, like he's the one who finally understood what justice was with that amazing A Theory of Justice book. But later in life, after much criticism, he acknowledges that his theory doesn't fit the conception of justice in many different cultures and languages. It's really an articulation, in his view, of what a liberal Western English language concept of justice would be, you know. And in some cultures, of course, justice has very little to do with distribution of goods and so on. It's much closer to an eye for an eye in every respect. Yeah, so I do think the more I don't know if I would say older or sophisticated you get in philosophy, maybe it's just the more conferences you go to around the world, or how many world congresses of philosophy to go to. I love those meetings every 5 years. It can completely alter your conception of philosophy. I would say my conception of philosophy has been altered so much by, God help me, 10 to 15 world congresses of philosophy I've gone to, and to experience in a human way how different that concept operates in different cultures. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and that's actually always my example of things we take for granted without knowing it is also if yes, if you travel between different cultures, right? I mean, or for me, like coming to the US or like living for some time somewhere else, there's a lot of things that you weren't aware of that you're doing, right? A lot of ways,
Mhm.
a lot of just in terms of values, ideals, or even if you speak different languages, right? How different languages structures reality differently. So it's no, I think so very much, and that's also yeah where you can see that. I mean, a part of philosophy I think is about yeah these fundamentals, not in terms of foundationalism, right? As you also criticize, this metaphysics of it, but like the fundamentals of what we rely on, right? Of what yeah what we take for granted, and also which gives us a hold, and that's something I mean where with Nietzsche, it's always this notion of, and I think this relates kind of to push further and to question these plausibilities, right? To question prejudice and so on, as something that seems to resonate also with America to some extent, right? And also especially this notion of going to the limits, pushing further is also this frontier spirit of the American spirit to some extent, right? And so there's this notion of is philosophy supposed to go to the edges, like to be kind of this frontier, like to go as far as we can, explorers, be explorers of the universe, of the mind, and so on? Or is it more about, I don't know, hanging out and talking about what the world is?
No, I think it's a bit of both. I mean, in my book, I think I used the phrase about Rorty, the red, white, and blue Nietzsche. You
Yes.
know, again, questioning a lot of these accepted consensus assumptions in professional philosophy. But when you think about, say, Islamic cultures where the idea of separating philosophy from theology would be absurd. I had Muslim students here, and I've had discussions with them about the degree to which you can challenge positions in Islam. If Islam means submission, if Islam means that the Quran settles everything, how do you question that? And, I've had the students say, well, no, we're not supposed to question that. Who are you to question what the Prophet said or what Allah said and so on? I said, well, what if you don't believe in Allah? And then they give you a look. But, the reality in Islam is just like in Judaism or Christianity. There are a lot of people who are officially Muslims, officially Jewish or Christian. They're born into it. Do they actually believe? Often not. Often they're going through, rituals. I gave a lecture at a university here, which is called Aligarh Muslim University. It's the most historic Muslim university in India. Was created by a guy in the 19th century who felt Indian Muslims were not getting a proper modern education, and he wanted to bring Oxford, Cambridge education to India, and he did it. So it's traditionally been a kind of free-thinking Muslim university with maybe 80% Muslim students and faculty and the rest, Hindu and others. I had one woman student I was talking to who I kind of presumed in my dopey Western way must be very devout. She's wearing the whole thingamajig and so on. And, as we discussed it, she said, well, I only wear this stuff because I have to here at school. If I'm away from my parents, I'm away from school. I don't wear any head garb and so on. I said, can I ask you really a tough question? I said, yeah. Do you believe in God? Do you believe in Allah? No. But in every respect, outwardly, she looks like a devout Muslim. So, we have obviously our societies in which, you can do Nietzsche, Death of God. In a modern sense, Christopher Hitchens' Death of God doesn't exist, the new atheist, and other cultures in which you get your head cut off if you said that in public, right? So, and they're both in some ways philosophical cultures, although I would say any culture that is totally under the heel of theological submission is not a philosophical culture, you know.
Yeah,
Uh,
very much. I like that. So Nietzsche, he admired the time before Plato, in a sense, right, where the pre-Socratics would it wasn't clear of what philosophy is, and you talk about this in relation to Isocrates, right, and even before that, right, when you had Heraclitus, Parmenides, so all these, so where basically the core of philosophy was unclear, right, and what we're looking for. And so, and then with Plato, with Nietzsche would say that philosophy became more impoverished, right? There was this one logos, there was the one truth, and there was the notion of equality. And so we lost, and Enrico Mueller, who's also in our foundation, he calls this the polyphony of Greek thinking before Plato, right? There was a polyphony of different voices and so on. And so we lost this. And it seems to me that you also have something similar in mind, right? When you talk about this is what's happening in America in a certain way, right? And so, and
Well,
yeah,
Reinhard, you may remember that Enrico and I had a back and forth in your essay series, so we don't agree on everything. But see, I would say part of my argument with Isocrates is there was a polyphony of philosophical voices even during this time, not just before, Socrates. I mean, the pre-Socratics, a lot of them are just thinking about like naturalist philosophers, how many elements are there, fire, water, air, that kind of thing, and it doesn't get more kind of rich and ethical, later. But so Isocrates was a little younger than Socrates and a little older than Plato. He comes right in between them, And again, it's a pretty sophisticated society, ancient, Athens, and his great concept was the concept of kairos, Kairos, which he considered the highest intellectual asset, and it was to know exactly what to do or what to say in a precise moment to achieve whatever your purposes was. That, and I guess in my mind, I translated as judgment or supreme judgment, superior judgment, or so on. But that means taking into account so many facts, circumstances. I mean, there's a famous case where Isocrates is in front of some tyrant and he declines to answer some question because he thinks if he answers it wrong, he may get killed. And he said, this is not the moment for that answer, and I am not the man for that answer. And, kind of avoids the question. So, I think there's a kind of real world savvy in Isocrates. I respect a lot of the Socratic dialogues, but another thing that is often forgotten is that Plato Socrates is just his version of Socrates. There's also Xenophon, and Xenophon's Socrates is somewhat different as a personality and as a thinker than Plato's. And of course, we don't have any writing from Socrates. So, and in contrast, I forget, it might be Aristotle, but either Aristotle or Isocrates, we have the most extant material of any ancient Greek thinker. So you don't have to guess what, Isocrates thought. There are 3 volumes in the Loeb Harvard Library, you know. So I would say, and I've said this in some, written material, that it's one of the great PR jobs in the history of philosophy, what Plato managed to do to Isocrates. And Aristotle didn't like Isocrates either. So, they kind of ganged up on him and he ended up being written out of the corpus. Yeah.
that's yes, super interesting. And it's also I like this notion of, in a sense, that it's competing philosophies, right? And that's all we have. Like, we can't really sit outside from above and say, well, this is philosophy, but there's always people part of a discourse, right? So very much it's part of power, right? I mean, Foucault talks about this, Nietzsche, I think Rorty has a similar notion of it. I mean, Plato, of course, and, we don't have to go there, but it's such a huge field, right? And the ways of how he writes and what the dialogue means also for his writings. And I guess but in terms of what lasted after Plato is this notion of the logos, right, and of dialectics, and it became so powerful, right, as
Mhm.
as the strongest power in a sense, and it took a long time, for us to realize this and recognize this.
Reinhard, I just wanted to say that, as you know, as a career journalist as well as a philosopher, I can't help always connecting really tactile, down-to-earth elements with the status of philosophers and the corpus and so on. So, for instance, I think, we like to think in philosophy that good arguments and good evidence and so on are what drive who's considered important, who's studied, and all that. But there's also just a kind of stasis that takes place in academic life. And here's what I mean by that. You're a graduate student in classics, say, or in classical philosophy, and you've gotten to the point where you're thinking of what your dissertation is going to be, right? You know that 95% of the classes, or more in classical Greek philosophy are going to be Plato and Socrates, right? Are you going to do a dissertation on Socrates? No way. And this was explained to me when I was a graduate student in a slightly different mode at Yale. There was a philosopher named Heinrich von Staden, German, eventually did his work at Tübingen, became a philosopher, but I discovered that he had been an Associated Press correspondent in the Africa before he went to graduate school. So he had this journalistic, background, and I was very interested in philosophical problems of journalism. I talked to him about possibly doing my dissertation on philosophical problems of journalism with him. So forget about it. You'll never get a job. You'll never get a job. You'll never get a job. Right? I think that's a syndrome that takes place, and it's a reason why you end up with so many dissertations on Kant, so many dissertations on Plato. It's a careerist decision, and it makes it very hard to alter an ossified canon in philosophy, as in some other fields too. There's similar things in English. You're going to do, a dissertation on Shakespeare when there are 100,000 Shakespeare classes, or you're going to do Marlowe, and we don't need a Marlowe person, but we do need someone to teach Shakespeare. Yeah, so
Yeah. Yeah, for
yeah.
sure. And this is, I mean, very much also what you, in terms of departmental politics, right? What you see, especially in terms of analytic philosophy, right? And so, and ironically, analytic philosophy is what then came from America and is now coming to Europe and all over the world, right? As a sense of America, the philosophical, as a non-philosophical adventure, in a sense.
One of the things you asked me, again, in floating some possible advanced topics to talk about is like, well, what would I write as a second volume or as an associated work and so on. So part of my project here is I am working on a manuscript I call Over There, the Internationalization of American Philosophy. And actually, it's not analytic philosophy that is taking, flame around the world. It's pragmatism of the old traditional sort, James, Dewey, Peirce, and so on. Although you can say it leads into Quine a little bit, and then Rorty as a neo-pragmatist. But I was struck over the last, whatever, 10 or 15 years at this intense interest in American pragmatism around the world. There are centers for Dewey studies everywhere, Shanghai. To my surprise, there's one in India, in Pune, Pune, a city here. Many different places. There's a William James, center in Germany. You got Axel Honneth taking a position at Columbia, Habermas, Karl Otto Appel getting so interested in the work of the pragmatists. So Dewey, for instance, had a famous disciple in China named Hu Xi. He had a famous disciple here in India named Ambedkar, who became a giant figure in India, kind of wrote the Indian Constitution, helped raise up the untouchables or the Dalits in Indian society. So I'm actually looking at, this expansion of American philosophy in other, places in the world, particularly pragmatism, but some people have extended that to sort of transcendentalism, to Emerson and Thoreau and so on. So, I would argue, again, some people might see it as jingoistic. I see it as journalistic, that I notice that where once it was only the French masters of thought, the German masters of thought that people were turning to elsewhere in the world. Now you're really seeing an ascension of some of the classical American thinkers. Not at the expense necessarily of European thinkers. I mean, people are still doing Heidegger, they're doing Foucault, and so on. But the Americans who weren't done, they are kind of rising to that level.
Yeah, yeah, that's interesting to see. One thought, yeah, I had before when preparing for this also, what would you say is the distinction maybe between Western and Eastern philosophy, right? I mean, there's something we just talked about in our seminar, for example. I think Derrida also talked, there is no Chinese philosophy, provocatively, right? And so
Mhm.
then it comes up with the question, yeah, what is philosophy, right? What defines philosophy? And pragmatism, I mean, it's of course it's an American creation, but it seems to me it follows, I mean, even like a Socrates, right? So it follows kind of like this European strain of philosophizing and with its own kind of version in a sense, right? But it seems very different from Chinese philosophy and maybe even Indian philosophy, right? And so I don't know if you have any thoughts on those.
Yeah, no, I have a lot of thoughts on that. I taught a course called Buddhism, Confucianism, and Asian Philosophy for a number of years, and I am actually the author of a main encyclopedia article in the Wiley-Blackwell Encyclopedia of the Philosophy of Religion on East Asian philosophy of religion. So believe it or not, I mean, my main area, yeah, is American and philosophy of journalism and so on. But in the American context, where we talk about areas of competence, Asian philosophy is one of mine. And believe it or not, I just gave two lectures in Sri Lanka on Buddhism and pragmatism and Buddhism and positive psychology to a huge auditorium of Buddhist monks. That was an experience. So, what would I say there? I'd say that there is this very simplistic notion that is still held by some analytic philosophers, but not all, that Asian philosophy, Chinese philosophy does not argue, does not provide evidence. It's either just storytelling or it's vignettes and so on. Um, and it's just not true. I mean, if you look at the Chinese philosophical tradition, there are figures. There's somebody named Zhuangzi, who is a kind of mystical storyteller, and Lao Tzu is a bit of an aphorist. But there are others in the Chinese tradition who really argue if A then B, B then C, C then D. Mengzi or Mencius is one of those. And if you tie together a number of things that Confucius says, you also see, an argument. So I think, strictly speaking, you might say, Chinese philosophy and Buddhist philosophy doesn't, or Taoism doesn't argue as much as classical Western philosophy, especially modern professional philosophy. But it's not true at all that there are no arguments. And in a way, I mean, we have stories that are told in Western philosophy, but people often describe them as examples rather than stories, But if you took every story in Chinese philosophy and said it's an example, it wouldn't be that much different than, Quine sometimes giving an example with Gavagai or Wittgenstein giving an example, of the building blocks of language and so on. So, yeah, the good news here is that there's been, I think, an enormous increase in East-West comparative philosophy. And I've attended and given presentations at the big East-West philosophy conference that takes place every couple of years in Hawaii. Um, so you have all sorts of wild comparisons. There's a Japanese philosopher named Nishida. The papers like Heidegger and Nishida, Nietzsche, Nishida. You know, um, I'm not sure how much I love those just, etch a sketch drawing lines between he said something similar to what he said, But it does indicate that often, a lot of the same issues are coming up in different philosophical, traditions. I should say too, since you asked about Indian philosophy, it's completely untrue about historical Indian philosophy that it's in the mode of Chinese storytelling when Chinese philosophy does tell stories. Ancient Indian philosophy is very epistemological, very analytic, and argumentative. You know, we have a modern, the Nobel winner, Amartya Sen, who wrote a book called The Argumentative Indian. They were very argumentative throughout their history. So Indian philosophy, especially when it departs from the theological, the Vedas and some things in Hinduism, is really more similar to, I'd say, British analytic philosophy than almost any other tradition in world philosophy. Yeah.
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 I mean, maybe one aspect that defines Western philosophy could be this notion of truth and the logos, right? In the sense of this monotheism also, right? There's this one truth, there's one logos, and then which also became dominant in Christianity. And so which then also led to the sciences in a certain way, right? And so that's maybe one big distinction, right, of how science developed in the West and then how technology developed and so on. And yeah, and it seems that something which you can see when you look at maybe the beginnings of ancient Greece, right, where you had the pre-Socratics and also with the gods, it seems a lot more Indian at the beginning, right? And then at
Mm.
some point you have the logos coming in, and it becomes this one core aspect, and so which survived then, and Nietzsche talks about this in terms of it's this truthfulness, right? And so even if we don't believe in truth anymore, we still pretend as if we do, and that's why we argue in a sense, right? This truthfulness, the will to truth. That is maybe one aspect what one could say, what you can see maybe in ancient Chinese philosophy, and maybe not as much in ancient Indian, also because it's just so diverse, right? There's just so many different fields. Whereas it seems to me in Western, it's more there's one marketplace and there's one concept of it where you all compete for it, right? But I'm just yeah, thinking out loud here.
Yeah, well, I mean, my philosophical approaches are very much influenced by my journalistic personality. I am a total believer that truth is over here and falsehood is over there, in any particular context. I believe truth is an intersubjective notion. There has to be a consensus of authorities that are respected, not because they are just authorities, but because in some way they're credentialed to know the way scientists are and so on. So, to me, Hegel somewhere says that the daily newspaper is his daily prayer. It's sort of the same for me. I mean, I love reading the newspapers. I find the creation of a daily newspaper to be one of the astonishing things in life, that you can capture what actually happened yesterday and ignore what didn't happen yesterday and gather all this information and so on. So, I'm completely against this idea of a post-truth culture. I think as soon as people separate themselves from, especially intellectuals and academics, from their official intellectual positions in philosophy and so on, everybody believes in truth. Everybody distinguishes truth from non-truth. Everybody stops on the red and goes on the green. Everybody knows that you drink clean water and try to avoid, polluted water. So, I find a lot of the questioning of truth in intellectual environments just total bullshit, really.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's often a debate of also truth in the Plato's sense, of in another world and so on, right? I mean, often, I mean, I think the easy way to,
I don't believe in that kind of truth. I
yeah,
don't
yeah,
believe in the ideal form of a
right.
chair and and,
But
and that kind of thing. But I do believe that one reaches consensual judgments, that this is a chair and
yeah,
that's a couch and that's a bed. And
yeah,
if people want to start mixing up those terms, maybe they can, I mean, take a word like gay, right? So it used to be joyous and then it becomes homosexual. I mean, the meaning of words can change, but they change because there is some consensus, as Wittgenstein saw, in usage, you know. And so now if you said like, oh, we had a gay time, that somebody would you'd explain you're using it in the old-fashioned sense or so on. Yeah, so I find there's a lot of artificiality and deception in thinkers who claim that you cannot determine what truth is, because I've never met anybody in academia or in intellectual life who didn't do that every single minute, distinguish truth from non-truth.
Hmm. For sure,
Yeah.
for sure. And I think an easy way out would just be to say that it's contextual truths, right? It's not truth connected to the divine, but it just, whatever, how big the context is, which could be on Earth, which could be the universe, which could be this discussion right now, right?
Right, yeah. I mean, a lot of truths are contextual. If you believe in the physical world, you believe, if Everest is the tallest mountain, that's not contextual, except, again, you can almost push every scientific concept to the idea of contextual. You know, Measurement is contextual. There has to be an agreement what we mean by measurement. There has to be an agreement what we mean by above sea level, right? By some interpretations, you could bring Everest down, to number three or so on. So I'm told, you know. Um, but yeah, I think most of us recognize that there are more contextual truths and less, contextual truths. I mean, the name of a country. Of course, it's contextual, Myanmar versus Burma. It's a political decision. I met a woman, the other day who insists on only saying Burma because she's very opposed to the junta, in Myanmar. My memory is that when Obama went to Myanmar, they said to him, remember, say Myanmar, say Myanmar, say Myanmar. I think in his first speech, he said, well, it's good to be here in Burma. So even presidents blow it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's yeah, super interesting. Just a few more things I was
Sure.
curious about. You talk about the philosopher as the casual wise man, right? And
Mm.
and I do like this notion also of, yes, you don't have to. Like, philosophy departments might give you a training, right? It gives you a certain style of kung fu or your jiu-jitsu, but you can do your own kind of fighting eventually, right? And so it's
Mm.
about wrestling with the truth. And so, and you mentioned, for example, Tony Robbins also briefly in your book, and say, for Tony Robbins to go elsewhere. And so I wonder, that field, which Tony Robbins is somebody I've dabbled a little bit with, and I've also wondered about this, about is he a philosopher, for example? And we can also speak more broadly about, the quote unquote self-help industry or self-growth, self-development, this whole industry, or also like the field of leadership, for example, right? And so there's a lot of things which are more practical, and they don't deal with what we just did with questions of truth, right? But more about, yeah, how can I orient myself more successfully, right? How can I orient myself in general? How can I live a good life, right? And so, but then the question is, of course, always, where is the line, right? Where does philosophy end, and where does sophistry or charlatanery or whatever begin? And that's sometimes it's hard to draw. And so with Tony Robbins, I tried to think about. I wrote a little piece about it. Eventually, I came down to the conclusion that he is a bit like the ancient sophists, in a sense of that he himself doesn't deal with these philosophical questions, but he offers models for orientation, like tools and techniques that help you to orient yourself, right? But
Mm.
isn't that philosophical work too, right? And so, yeah, I don't know what your thoughts on.
Well, I'll start. You began with a casual wise man, and I had the one person who I was told I was really pushing the envelope with was Hugh Hefner, the founder
Yes.
of Playboy. I'm just going to hold this up to the camera. Umberto Eco, the Italian philosopher, gave me a very nice blurb on the back of my book, genuinely exciting and provocative. He said to me, Carlino, you are really pushing the envelope with Hugh Hefner. Okay. I tried, by the way, to get a photo of Hugh Hefner that in which he was not surrounded by 20 bunnies, where he looked like a philosopher. Took me forever. At first, they were going to charge me $2,000, but I had interviewed Hefner. I knew the chief PR guy at Playboy. He promised he'd work hard and work hard. And we finally got this picture where he looks like Bertrand Russell
Yeah.
with the pipe. And you know, I genuinely thought he can fit into that category of casual Wiseman because while people don't really know this, he did publish a book called The Playboy Philosophy. Of all his editorials, he was a great civil libertarian, first person to bring black jazz musicians on TV in the United States. So very respected by civil libertarian types and by feminists who were fine with sexuality. In the feminist movement, many, hated Playboy as a form of pornography. Others saw Playboy also liberating, female sexuality. So the difference of opinion. So I think one of the questions with self-help people is always, how genuinely questioning are they of life and their interpretation of life, and how much are they mainly interested in just selling you a service and getting money from you, right? And this fits into, what I argue in the book about highbrow, middlebrow, lowbrow, and whether we should immediately compartmentalize people that way. Now, I'm not terribly familiar with Tony Robbins, or I know who he is, but I haven't read what he's written and so on. But I'll give you a kind of comparative example that I'd say is more philosophical. So I said I spoke in Sri Lanka about Buddhism and positive psychology. So positive psychology is now a well-established element of the psychology profession that was basically created by my friend and colleague Martin Seligman, a big psychology professor at Penn, who's in his early 80s, former philosophy major at Princeton, very close to Robert Nozick, studied with Nozick. And bizarrely, we met in a online forum put on by the Princeton Philosophy Department. He was there as a graduate. I was there as a graduate. He didn't like the lecture. I liked what he said about the lecture. When he raised his hand, he invited me out to his place. We became friends over the last few years. What did Seligman do? He looked at his discipline, psychology, and said, "This is 99%. All we do is concentrate on dysfunctional people with all sorts of psychological problems. Why shouldn't we also try to help people who are reasonably healthy become even healthier, become even happier? Part of psychology should be directed at getting people happier, and there's a way to do it, and you could train people to be optimistic and so on." And he became president of the American Psychological Association. He basically created this field, which now is all over the world. I've discovered. And this is where there may be a difference with the Robbins. All the time he insisted, I am a scientist, I'm doing studies, I'm trying to show that this is true in conventional ways in psychology by doing studies, by doing experiments and tests. And he very much believes he has shown that you can basically instruct and train people to be happier, to be more optimistic. He's gotten all sorts of contracts from police departments, the military, and so on and so forth. And he teaches this at Penn in a Master's of Applied Positive Psychology. So I don't know the degree. A lot of self-help people are just spouting, do this, do that, here's what I suggest, and all that. If they are genuinely generalizing about life based on their experience, everything they've read and they've taken in, and so on, and not cynically just trying to sell lectures like $10,000 a shot or something, I might accept them as philosophers who are also in business, right? There's a guy in India, I've often asked the Indian philosophy professors, his name is Osho, that's his book, Osho. Guy in a bookstore here said, "Oh, you should read Osho. Let me take you over to Osho." I thought he was going to take me over to a book. He took me over to a whole section. The guy must have 50 books or so, you know. I asked my philosophy professor friends here, "Do you teach Osho?" "Oh, no, 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 no. He's like a popular guy. He's not serious," and so on. I don't know. I've never read him, but maybe if I were Indian and I were writing India the Philosophical, he'd be in my casual, wise man section. But to me, it has to do with your honesty, as a philosopher, your honesty, your putting forth of evidence, your skepticism, your openness to contrary evidence. All of these are the things that I think, make you philosophical. If you're just trying to invent slogans that sell and make money, then I don't think you're a genuine philosopher. You paid some attention to this. What do you think of Robbins? Is he a charlatan? Is he just trying to make money, or do you think he's a genuine thinker?
I don't think he's a charlatan. He's definitely trying to make money. I mean, he's also in just the environment, right? I mean, America is, in distinction from Europe, a bit more money focused. It just how it
Yeah,
is, at least with continental Europe, right? And if you want to be successful here, money will most always play a role in this, right? And
yeah.
so, no,
And and there is the case. I'm trying to think. What's his name? Jordan Peterson.
yeah,
Do I
for
have
example, yeah,
do I have his name right?
yeah,
Where, you can be an academic thinker and then somehow you catch on with the public, and then suddenly you're being offered big money to give talks and all of that. And I think there, outsiders have to be fair in saying, listen, the mere fact that somebody's become popular, and is getting a lot of money should not undermine their status if they began as genuine thinkers, and the only difference between then and now is that you become popular, because this is a very traditional thing in academia, that the more popular somebody becomes, people employing Schadenfreude, want to see you go down, want to see you knocked off your pedestal and treat you as less serious.
yeah, yeah, exactly. For sure. I mean, and that reason alone is, I think, for many professional philosophers, a reason not to deal with them at all. Right? As soon as they make money, they don't want to deal with it because it looks like charlatanery, basically.
Yeah, and by the way, this goes back to ancient Greece too, where
Yeah.
the issue of whether Isocrates was taking money from people in his school when somebody else might not be, taking money, and you could make the argument, well, I'm trying to teach them to be responsible, that these things have a value and a service, and so they should be paid for, or the only reputable philosophy is a philosophy that's free, as with Socrates, kibitzing with everybody. I think in the end, you can't ride your judgment on whether somebody's making money or not, but you can ride your judgment on whether that is the chief aim, and that this was sophistry, like say whatever sells, or say whatever persuades, whether it's true or not. Then I think you are in the realm of sophistry, and Isocrates always denied he was doing that.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And it seems that the no I mean the pragmatic notion of philosophy, which is also at the core, I think, of the philosophy of orientation, for example, right? The one of the core questions I always say is not about what is truth, but how do we orient ourselves to truth, right? And it's a very pragmatic sense. And so how do we live? And I mean that's, I think, what was also the one of the core questions of Heidegger, for example, right? What does it mean to be before we start to theorize and so on? And that seems to open again this way to people like Jordan Peterson, and Tony Robbins and this whole industry. And but it's hard, I think, to draw the line exactly. And you might
Well,
have both, you know.
I do think, I mean, yeah, you remember also I did an essay for you on orientation in journalism and trying to pull those together, and the aspect of pragmatism. And I think, here, orientation in my mind is often a first step. In other words, I think of orientation also as a form of attentiveness. But here is where orientation maybe can't answer all your questions philosophically. So again, I'm an indefatigable reader of newspapers, and sometimes when I've talked about positive psychology and the way that we're all wired differently, I say, well, so I've traditionally been a cheerful, upbeat person. I've never felt I needed drugs or drink or whatever to be in a good mood day by day. And Marty Seligman, my friend, says, you are very lucky that you are wired that way. Not everybody is. And I want you in a study group and so on. But I've also made the argument that I feel part of that mentality is it comes from my orientation to what is happening in the world through reading newspapers constantly. So I've never had a heart attack, I've never had a serious disease and so on. By reading the papers, I understand I've been very lucky my whole life not to have my plane go down and so on and so forth. And I think that's one of the explanations for my positive outlook. But I've had so many students when we talk about this say, "Oh, I'm just the opposite. If I follow the news, it's so depressing. It makes me so depressed. I feel like I'm going to be on the next plane that crashed, or I'm going to be a victim of the next mass shooting, and so on." And so you could have equal orientations, like two people who are reading four newspapers a day, and one of them feels like I want to jump off the roof as a result, and the other one, gee, how lucky I am.
Hmm.
So, or orientation can help you a lot in decision making and what A leads to B leads to C, but we're all, subject to luck. And when it comes to the interpretation of that to which you are oriented, I don't think orientation itself can solve that problem. There's always an interpretive element about what you're oriented to that could go in more than one direction.
Yeah, yeah. I mean that is, I think, one of the core aspects, right, of orientation is this notion of you can always orient yourself differently, right? There's always an alternative to the way that we view the world, and I think that's yeah where it helps, right? Where it makes the connection to what you're saying, Seligman, and so on, right? There's what the situation that I'm in, I could always view it differently, and it's not objectively given in that sense, right? But
Mhm.
the universe is endless in that way of how
Well,
we
I
view.
mean, I think on the whole, one of the good things about orientation is greater awareness of everything, having more factual information in your head,
Yeah.
knowing how things work in different areas of life and so on, is almost inevitably going to lead to better results,
Mhm.
but not automatically, right? Because you cannot, you could be the smartest person in the world and you get on that plane with the drunk pilot and it's over,
Mhm.
right? Are you supposed to have so much knowledge that you've investigated the drinking habits of your pilot? Nobody does that,
Mhm.
right? I mean, a lot of stuff is outside our control, no matter how well oriented, we are. So, I think that's a good example. The distinction between saying, I will not fly that airline because it's had a number of crashes. I remember our African correspondent once telling me, like, do not fly X and Y. Um, and taking your orientation to information to the extent that I would like to know who my pilot is going to be before I get on this flight. And do you have a kind of biography? And, you know, life doesn't provide that. So you're just guessing.
Yeah.
You're
Yeah.
hoping.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. Oh, it's a
Yeah.
balancing act.
Yeah.
Maybe one final question. So right now we're preparing a seminar on the question of what the constraints of philosophy are today. What are the limitations, right? And so I think, and we touched on one of them was this question of academia, academic philosophizing. And as you said, right, kind of if you're writing a dissertation, you want job market, you want reputation, you want job security, and so on. So that's the limitation. That's the limitation of thought, right?
Mhm.
So the stronger that is, the stronger the limitation. And then the question is also, I mean, who controls that? Like what forces are behind this, right? Of course, it's the academic apparatus. I mean, now with Trump, there's a question of politics and academia. To what extent are they connected? And I mean, and as you say, one important aspect of American philosophizing is the free speech aspect, right? Which, for example, is a bit more limited in Europe traditionally, right? In Germany, it is. And so that's a constraint in a way, right? But then also, if you think about technology, right, and cyber philosophy, it comes with certain constraints as well, and there are power structures that are involved. In Germany, for example, you're not supposed to question democracy, right, because of our past, for example. But
Right.
is that a constraint of thinking? I guess it is, right? I mean, it is a
Absolutely, yeah.
strain of philosophizing, a
I
philosophical.
mean, if Trump getting elected president doesn't make you question democracy or at least one form of it, then you're not paying attention.
Right?
You
Exactly.
know.
Yeah. And then also, I mean, even like science, for example, right? Because as far as philosophy relies on science and how science operates, it doesn't question science itself, right? And so there's certain things it relies on. So yeah, I don't know. I know these are, wide questions, big questions, but
No, but I do think that what characterizes philosophy is pushing through all of those against limitation in your actual, thinking. So, I mean, take the founder of Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, who was a very, very highly educated Cambridge, lawyer and thinker about democracy. At one point, he floated the idea, I don't think they ever did it in Singapore, but I'm not sure that the number of votes you have should be connected to your education. As if, like a PhD, you get 3 votes, you're uneducated, you get 1 vote, and all that. Interesting idea, right? And has been always part of the discussion of democracy. If the demos is full of ignorant people, isn't that a danger? That's what has gotten some people to believe that elites, oligarchies, should run things. I still think that we do have probably of any country I've ever been in, even though Trump is questioning it now and kind of making people suffer, the widest freedom of expression of any country in history, actually in the United States. I mean, it's still true. You can call Trump an idiot, a rapist, a thief, everything you want. And in general, you're not going to be arrested. You may get in trouble if you're in a serious position that he can fire you or whatever. But as we've seen, he's firing people who don't say a word just because he assumes their politics are contrary. So I think, it's still a good place to do philosophy. I'd also say, and this I talk about a little bit in the end of one of my opening sections about the APA, the American Philosophical Association. It ends with a guy named Georg Theiner, an Austrian, who got a job, and I think he's still at Villanova. And he's talking about the openness of looking for an academic job in the United States. How so much of getting a professorship in philosophy in Europe is the old boy network. You're the disciple of some big philosopher, he gets you a job at his friend's department, and so on. And that Theiner was amazed, and he speaks to this, at how meritocratic the APA process was. He filed applications, he had interviews, he didn't know anybody at Villanova, he had no rabbi watching over him. He got an assistant professorship job. And in contrast, I'll just tell you this anecdote, maybe as we close. The last time I was in Frankfurt, I went to the Museum of Communication. And the woman there working the desk was a former graduate student in philosophy at Goethe University. Um, so we started talking about philosophy and all of that. And she told me that she had left for 2 reasons. There was some kind of movement of really like incel type harassment of women. That was part of it. But the other was this system of advancing in philosophy in Germany. And she said a line that has stuck in my head and I've repeated to some people since. She said, in Germany, every full professor of philosophy is a king in his kingdom. And she said, and unless you genuflect, unless you do whatever you're supposed to, she wasn't talking about sexual stuff, just like being in line with the thinking and revering of that person, you're not going anywhere in academic philosophy in Germany. And so I do think that, there's some of that in the US, but I do think that it's radically different because of the way that our academic disciplines run, and that you can get a job without, kowtowing to a professor and so on. And you can get outside letter writers if, like, your advisor has turned against you or something. So, I do think there are limitations, but ultimately, for any thinker or writer, the chief limitation is your own lack of courage. I mean, nobody can really stop you from saying what you think if you have the courage to do that as a writer or thinker. And I'm not saying I'm the most courageous person in the world, but I've had a lot of controversies because I said what I thought. And some people didn't like it. But that, to me, that's part of being a critic or, a philosopher. And if you're just trying to avoid controversy, you're probably not a very sincere thinker or writer.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Yeah, I like that a lot.
Mm.
And thanks for the anecdote. And that's something. One more thought I was thinking about when preparing for this podcast. The difference between, or what makes America America, right? And one thing that I always notice, at least comparison to Germany, is that the greatest hero of America is the entrepreneur, right? He, I would say, is like the ultimate. That's the American way, the frontier who does something new, a little bit dangerous, a little bit illegal, perhaps. You go into gray areas, you're on the frontier, a little bit of Wild West, and so on. That's it seems to me is like the hero of America. Whereas in Germany, to me, it seems the hero is the professor, right? The academic.
Mm.
Like it doesn't have to be the philosophy professor, but just the scientist in general, like the one who is. That's why you have a lot more academics in the parliament, for example, also in Germany, right? But also even in media, there's a certain like aesthetic way of how professors are also being portrayed and so on, right? And so it seems that this maybe also structures the way of how we understand philosophy. Whereas like America, the philosophical is then more a bit this venturing, this courageous, this questioning of certainties, and that's why maybe people like Musk become philosophers, right? Or they have a philosophical impact, right? Which you see a lot less in Germany, for example.
Yeah, and of course Musk is not an American, he's South African originally, and so, you see people like Peter Singer also, right? Australian, not, but they come to the US and they lead somewhat philosophical lives while one is in business and the other is in, academia. But I guess I disagree. I'd probably put movie stars ahead of entrepreneurs if I was thinking about who the real heroes are to most Americans. So again, the less educated and the less sophisticated Americans are, I would say, yeah, they gravitate toward, big money and big fame, and big athletes, that these are the big, heroes. I'm not sure that there's a lot of hero worship for business people who are seen to be unethical or who've tricked their way into success. But it is one of the things that has been discovered in survey after survey that the same people who will say it's outrageous that the CEO is making 345 times that of a lower level employee, but I wish I were that CEO, and I hope I'm going to also become rich someday. This is one of the traditional idiosyncrasies of American culture that uh, actually one of the people I write about in my America section, Lipset, talks about the miracle that we have a class system in a country that doesn't believe in classes, you know, and thinks everybody is egalitarian and so on. But I do think that fame is actually a bigger deal to a lot of Americans than pure money, you know? And that's why the celebrity culture is as big as it is, and why people get excited just to like touch Al Pacino or Kate Perry or someone like that. But I think when you build a business, from the ground up, there is a lot of, respect. But I can think of people who have gone the wrong way. They made a lot of money and then they were revealed. I mean, look at someone like Diddy, now on trial and so on, right? So it turns out he made a lot of money, but he also is crazy and raping people and all of that stuff, right? He will not, I mean, even if he ends up in jail and he's a near billionaire or so, he's not going to have a lot of respect. Kim Kardashian, she has all of that money, all of that fame, but it's considered not to be based on much. And I don't think she's respected all that much, So I think it really depends. Well, someone like Steve Jobs, who came from nothing and really did it all on his own and got knocked down and got up again with Apple, then I think you do see that tremendous amount of respect. But I agree with you. In my opening chapter, you'll see when I'm making the argument for America, the unphilosophical, it's very much along the lines of what you've just observed. Like our philosophers are not involved in the media, our philosophers are not involved in politics. They seem to have no influence on public life. How can America be philosophical? So, anybody who reads the book will see that, well, there's like a 30-page chapter laying that out, and then there's 600 pages making the counter argument. So,
Yeah, no, that's great points. So I guess we're at the end. Carlin, thank you so much for being on my podcast. Are you
my pleasure.
are you working on any book right now?
Well, I mean, one of the things is that over there, the internationalization of American philosophy. So I'm a Fulbright senior scholar. The boilerplate says for academic and professional excellence. I accept that if they think so. Um, I'm distinguished visiting professor of philosophy at University of Delhi, visiting professor of humanities at Ashoka. And what I'm really trying to do is look at pragmatism in the Indian context. So I've written a lot of that book already. I've written a lot about Huxi in China, and now I'm trying to concentrate on this figure, Ambedkar, and other ways in which the pragmatic spirit either does express itself in Indian society or doesn't. Um, so obviously 1.4 billion people, it's kind of complicated.
Yeah, interesting.
So,
No, that's exciting.
yeah.
All
So
right.
listen, I look forward to our next anniversary again. That was so much fun for all of us to be together for the fifth there in
Yeah, yeah, it was great to have you.
Nashville.
Yeah, it was great to have you, and thank you for being part of the foundation for all these years.
Oh yeah, many more years to come, we hope, and
Yes, of course.
regards to Mike and family.
We'll do. We'll do.